This is paradise for me. This is the place in the world I value most of all. The southwestern part of Finland, the Grand Archipelago. Peace, calm, quiet. And in journalistic terms, one might also describe Finland as a paradise. High levels of trust in the media, top scores when it comes to press freedom. And also a paradise when it comes to equality, the youngest prime minister in the world, and all the leaders in the government are females. But I realize that we are in no way an island. Global trends, both good and bad, have always reached Finland with a slight delay, and I have a gut feeling that this will be the case also regarding mistrust towards the media. Polarization pushes us away from each other. I feel both fear and anxiety when I see how a toxic blend of anger and mistrust has divided both the US and also the UK. And also how media actually can make it worse. So I ask myself, what can I do in my work in order to prevent this from happening in Finland, in my paradise? I'm responsible for the audience dialogue at my company, and a very large part of my work has been about responding to audiences' claims and complaints about bias and about political correctness. And there is, for some reason, one particularly active group. They are mostly middle-aged or older men. If I would distill their criticism into one single sentence, it would be this: you are a bunch of politically correct feminist red-green wannabe reporters with a liberal agenda. Now, I have read and I have heard this message so many times that it has made me both frustrated and angry. Feedback like this in heavy doses can really suck the energy out of anyone. I call this group the grumpy old men. So, I was enthusiastic like a little boy when I arrived in Oxford in October. You know, finally a break from this constant whining, finally a break from the grumpy old men and a place to breathe some fresh air of knowledge and academia. I mean, can you see how relieved I look? But in the back of my head, I knew I had to confront this task in some way. I couldn't simply brush away the grumpy old men simply as, annoying. This feedback was so vast and so coherent, and it was definitely signaling something bigger in the making. It was a symptom of something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And during the autumn, I witnessed the same symptoms again and again. Let's look at one example. In mid-October, this news hit the headlines in Finland. A decision by the Helsinki University cafeterias to take out beef from lunch menus in order to, provide a more vegetarian fare, and of course to battle climate change. A pretty small adjustment, one would think. But this decision caused an absolute uproar among certain sections of the Finnish political class. One MP called the decision a travesty perpetrated by the veggie mafia, and another prominent MP said the menu adjustment, which it was part of a culture war. And this war of words raged on for a week in the Finnish media. Now, needless to say, beef was not the actual issue here, and neither were the complaints of the audience about our reporting on climate change, or on gender issues, or on sexual minorities, on the difference between urban and rural life, or indeed on food and diet. But these are some of the favorite subjects of the grumpy old men. Now, in Oxford, I tried to grasp the symptoms from a new angle, and that's when I stumbled upon this new book by the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama. And when I started reading, I was constantly nodding in the library, and I sat there telling myself, wow, this guy really has an explanation. to all of this. So what's Fukuyama saying in his book? Well, basically, that identity and everything we attach to that, who we are, is a much more powerful force in politics than the left-right divide. And there's one quote in Fukuyama's book which struck me as particularly compelling. It's this: "A humiliated group seeking restitution of its dignity carries far more emotional weight than people simply pursuing their economic advantage." So, conflicts are no longer so much about who gets the larger share of the pie, about the have and have not, but about who we are, about the emotional weight, like Fukuyama says, about feelings of humiliation and the craving for recognition. And here's the problem. When it comes to economic issues, we tend to accept a compromise, but identity is non-negotiable. It's more categorical. Either you recognize me or you don't. So how should a tax-funded public service broadcaster like YLE, which I work for, place itself in these emotionally charged culture wars? And what should reporting look like when every piece of information risks being interpreted as taking sides? Well, at least we have to stop dramatizing stuff for no apparent reason, because questions about identity, for instance, the one about whether you have the right to eat beef in a student restaurant or not, they often involve ridiculous small conflicts. But they often include every ingredient necessary for a juicy story. They're simple disputes around emotionally charged symbolic issues. And yes, I understand the temptation to jump on these stories. It can be almost impossible for journalists to resist when some new outrage or flavor of the day controversy pops up. But by telling the audience about these fights, we're not merely reporting on them, we're actually throwing more gasoline on the flames. So we must have the courage to step back, take a deep breath. We must get better at seeing what is generally relevant, in other words, newsworthy, and what is just random noise out there. Let's not attach meaning to something that hasn't got any meaning. So, there's been a lot of talk during the past few years about transparency in journalism, that we should be more open about the way we work, how we choose the subjects we cover, how we reach our conclusions, and on the basis of what sources. Fine, let's have more of that. But that's not how the human brain works. Building trust is also an emotional issue. What's the emotional story about journalism if facts and trustworthiness are not enough? Now, I'm not more certain than anybody else in this room. I'm actually as confused as most of us are. But I think it's back to basics and about two things, about pride and humility. Pride, because we must stop bashing ourselves as journalists. And humility, because we will always be at the mercy of our audiences. So, what is my proud answer to these grumpy old guys rambling about the same old stuff all over again? Well, first of all, I'm still damn proud of my profession, and I believe I have a reason to be so. Journalism, like any other handicraft, is about professional expertise. We do an enormous amount of truth-seeking based on classical principles of journalism. So they can repeat their line forever, but I will always repeat mine, which is this. All the ways that information is handled are not equal. Some methods for handling information are simply better underpinned and more responsible. And you can be sure that we will continue to take pride in the fact that we represent the latter. But I'm not claiming we are flawless. Far from it. So I have a humble answer to them as well. Yes, there is a grain of truth in what they claim. You know why? Because I think we're still obsessed with storytelling, but less with listening. And these ideals of objectivity and being neutral, they are so deeply rooted in our professional DNA that if guys like these even question it, we almost find it a bit offensive. So they're right. We can definitely do better by openly admitting mistakes and by better trying to understand what lies behind their suspicion and mistrust. Because gaining their trust is as important as gaining the trust of anybody else's. That does not mean that we'll abandon the principles we believe in just to appease them. But it definitely means that we must practice what we preach.